Now, we've all been expecting this to happen. I had to cover it at some point. It's been the talk of Twitter. He's been everywhere in the news. People can't shut up about this man. We're going to have to talk about Lee Anderson. Now, for those who are not in the know, Lee Anderson is somebody who has been incredibly. He seems like he trends on Twitter every other day. He is colloquially known as 30p Lee for suggesting that people who are going to food banks should be making meals on average at 30p a day. Because he has no ability to be able to sympathise with those who are in a position about having difficulty being able to afford food. Just going to, before we continue, I'm going to reiterate what Martin Lewis was saying before about people going to 50%, people going to the Citizens Advice Bureau after going through all of the methods that they have of being able to reduce their financial outgoings, are still not earning enough to pay all of their bills and all of their outgoings after them being minimised by the Citizens Advice Bureau's advice. But I digress. He then also went viral after all of that. He's getting into I think he got into a violent altercation with a member of the public on camera, no less. He tweeted out a picture of one of his staffers who he said lived fine off 30k a year, who was then confirmed to also have gone to an incredibly prestigious private school that was worth like 20 grand a year, and the son of some kind of baron. He's an incredibly expensive MP, so he actually has a huge bill of expenses in his current within his role as an MP. His MP's expenses is very high. That's true, Big Al's. He had to have a fight on camera with Steve Bray. And in general, what he's been doing, his base kind of platform that he's used, right? What he speaks out a lot about these kind of issues that were pretty. They had a lot of exposure in the early 2010s, right? He'll talk about people on benefits. He'll talk about the quote-unquote work shy. He'll try and demonise foreigners. He's had public spats about things like transgender people, like Eddie Izzard. There was a conversation he had about Eddie Izzard previously on camera as well, on like an official news programme, saying some pretty heinous stuff. He is clearly being used as some kind of right-wing culture warrior at this point in time. And the things that he said, he recently came out in support of capital punishment as well, which has always been something that's never really come into public discourse. And I think that it's good that it hasn't, but there is still a lot of support for it. Polls around capital punishment, they tend to be between 40 to 55% support for it. So it's always around about 50-50. There's never it's pretty contentious whether or not the public do or don't support it, but it never comes up in political discussion because it's incredibly politically toxic, so it never usually gets discussed, right? But as I've said many times on this programme, now we're in a world in which the Conservatives can't be trusted on the economy. They're going to be using the culture war more and more and more to be able to fight the next election on something other than the economy because they know that they will lose. You're right, MCH. Lee is a natural poster boy for a certain section of the electorate. What has happened, though? What has happened is that the discussion has turned from being around the things that he does say or what he says or does, but to the people that he theoretically would represent. Now, what the kind of media discussion about his position has been, the discussion has been, well, actually, the people who dislike him, the people who find his views objectionable, belong to the quote-unquote metropolitan liberal elite, and it is somehow, by opposing the shit that he says, you are somehow denigrating the working class that clearly they assume that he must be a part of. Now, there's no such thing as a working class MP. Class is a relationship to production. MPs are public servants. They belong to a completely different class as public servants. So you can't be a working class MP. You can be an MP from a working class background. Now, I don't know his personal background, so I can't possibly say, but what I do know is that he used to be a Labour councillor before then switching to the Conservative Party during the 2010s. So the idea that he has some kind of specific political allegiance, you can call that into question, but it's clear he came up through usually being a Labour councillor and then switched allegiances. I think it was around during the Corbyn years, I believe, something like that. Either way, it's clear that in a world in which everyone seems to want to discuss about the quote-unquote red wall, That seems to be the big political discussion at the moment. The idea of Labour losing the working class, there being some kind of liberal establishment at the top of politics who refuse to see anything outside of their political bubble, which, of course, there is plenty of truth to that statement. But I would say from the left rather than from the right. He worked as I thought it was his dad that worked as a coal miner rather than himself. Because I remember on Twitter they were talking about him being on picket lines with his coal miner dad during the Thatcher administration. So he really is part of Thatcher's children at the end of the day. People who were radicalised to right wing neoliberalism as a child. But anyway, born in Nottinghamshire, John Davies Primary School, Ashfield School. Father was a coal miner. He worked as a coal miner for 10 years and then volunteered at the Citizens Advice for another decade. Oh, so he was actually a coal miner himself. So he really is genuinely from the working class background. So, I mean, I did assume that he was, but nice to have that ratified by people in chat. I do appreciate that. Now, the problem that I have with a lot of this framing about him being some kind of quote-unquote representative of the working class. Like I think I bookmarked a tweet that rubbed me up the wrong way. This is the one I found. So let me have a look at this one. If Twitter will fucking load, there we go. Where, who is Lee Anderson? Fascinating and balanced profile, gets to the heart of the England that Anderson represents. This makes a lot of the commentary on seem very shallow. Wasn't the Twitter pile on Anderson revealing? This is 7 years since the referendum and still little reflection about what happened and why. Precisely, it's staggering. And then the commentary on top of this is someone who does good tweets. Many of our galaxy brain journos appear to operate under the illusion that most people up north are essentially just Lee Anderson. They will snigger at you or ignore you completely if you're one of the many living people up north, telling that they are just talking pure shite. And that is true. People will make this kind of assumption that there is this innate classism coming from the quote-unquote liberal elite about the discussions that we have around Lee Anderson and the politics that he represents and the people that he represents. And it is just as much of a classist generalising trope that the liberals do when they try and view all working class people with the same level of scorn that they pour on Lee Anderson. It is also that same classism from the right to assume that Lee Anderson is just representative of the entire working class as a whole. And even tweeting out a meme from Phil McDuff earlier, which I think gets to my point about the discussion that we're having around Lee Anderson. Where, yeah, like, the most racist person you've ever met is apparently the sole legitimate voice of the working class in this world, which absolutely drives me insane. And the reason why it drives me insane is because he isn't a representative of the working class in general. He doesn't represent the entirety of the working class, but he does culturally represent the way the media will frame the existence of the working class, in that when people think about the working class in the media, in general parlance in this country, they usually think about the kind of cultural trappings that surround our understanding of the working class, rather than the actual people who sell their labour power and do not own the means of production, which is the actual definition of what working class means. So when people think working class, they just think regional accent, wearing a flat cap. They think all of these, again, what I was just talking about, it's a very centrist understanding of it. It's a very non-Marxist way of understanding it, I guess, but it's all about cultural signifiers and never about the actual world in which these people inhabit. Now, the reason why they do this thing specifically, erasing whippets, yeah, exactly. The reason why they do this thing is because there's a very large demographic shift that's the fault of the Thatcher administration. In that, we got to remember, right? We've got to remember, whenever the Conservative Party, or the Labour Party for that matter, are doing any kind of large policy thing or large optical thing, like, for example, what they're doing by making Lee Anderson vice chair or deputy chair of the Conservative Party, is it's not being done for any reason to do with the utility of his position there within the inner workings of the party, right? It's being done specifically optically. And if it's going to be done specifically optically, there's going to be specific electoral reasons for them doing so as well. Now, we all have to remember that when you look at electoral demographics, the vast majority of young people will vote Labour, the vast majority of older people will vote Conservative, rich people will vote Conservative, poor people will vote Labour, right? They're in the world of first past the post, where there is essentially a political duopoly, especially in England specifically, All of our electoral fights are fighting for the same group of people, the swing voter demographics. And this is who Lee Anderson secretly represents. Now, one of the results of the Thatcher administration was the death of manufacturing in the north, which is why a lot of northern towns generally tend to vote for Labour because of what Thatcher did to, for example, the miners, as we were talking about before. And those communities got devastated by the Thatcher administration, and so they voted Labour for a very, very long time, regardless of the fact whether it's in their interests or not to do so. There is now, since the death of manufacturing, actually the death of jobs in the north, a lot of these smaller market towns or ex-manufacturing towns or ex-mining towns in the north, they're fucking ghost towns now. You've seen the pictures of high streets with loads of boarded up shops, right? You go to Whitehaven. And you go to Whitehaven now, which is basically everyone who lives in Whitehaven just feeds Sellafield now. The entire high street is just full of closed shops, unless it's a betting shops or Poundland. Because what's happened is the lack of investment in these areas, the lack of jobs in these areas, the death of manufacturing in these areas has essentially meant that every single young person that comes out of these communities, they can't make a living there. They can't find a job in the local area around where their parents live. And a lot of the huge numbers of these working people are now going to university. We had far more working class people in university over the Blair years, for sure, than ever have been in this country. It's been an explosion of university attendance amongst working class people in this country. And what happens in these situations? If you're a young person, there's very few universities in these small towns. There's very few jobs in these small towns. So what do? If you're a young person, you move away and you go and live in a city. Because that's where the jobs are, that's where the universities are, that's where the opportunities are. Because there's not enough jobs in these small towns where, in the Red Wall, where the electoral battlegrounds are apparently going to be fought. Young people conglomerating in large cities is only ever going to ensure that Labour's vote share is concentrated in a single place, and it turns more constituencies outside of there into swing communities. Like if I bring up a map, let me find. I think I found it on my phone before, but constituency map by age. I think this was the one I was looking at before. Nope, that's not the one I'm looking at. This is the one. Yeah, interesting. Open image, new tab. Let me find it. So you look here, and you will see where all of these red spots are where young people are. It's all of the young constituencies are all very small, individualized city areas. Whereas all of the other, the vast majority of the constituencies in this country are older than they are younger, right? You look at where the yellow is, where it's kind of on the average. There's fewer of them, or they're more conglomerated around city areas, and then the older ones are all elsewhere spread out. And these are the battleground constituencies, right? All of the young constituencies they're all solid Labour, and that's where their vote share is conglomerated within a world of first past the post voting. And this gets us back to the central point of what I'm talking about here. And the central point that I'm talking about is where the divide around Lee Anderson's politics comes down to. The divide for Lee Anderson's politics is not a class divide. It's not a class divide. It's an age divide. He is not there to be the representative of working class people, because the working class movement is actually is left wing in comparison to the kind of political bent of Lee Anderson specifically. What he is there for is to appeal to older people. When you look at these cultural issues that Lee Anderson is supposed to be the standard bearer for, it's people in their 50s and 60s, not the retired people who are almost close to retirement. The people who think about like the work-shy young people, the kind of people who are in support of the death penalty, who are culturally far more conservative, right? These people, as they're older, are far more likely to have more asset wealth. They're less likely to be working class than younger people are. And these are the people who he appeals to specifically. And what are these people as well? These are the swing voters. Pensioners, Tories. Students, young working people, millennials, all Labour voters. People who are within that age range, who are more likely to be homeowners, that have culturally conservative opinions, these are the swing voters, and they're specifically who Lee Anderson is there to appeal to. Because in these not rural constituencies, but not urban or suburban constituencies, the red wall constituencies, they are the swing voters, and that is specifically who they are trying to target by promoting the idea of Lee Anderson. And that's the problem, because most of these people, if they are close to retirement, the time in which they're going to have material interests in common with genuine working people, those days are numbered. Those days are really numbered, and soon they'll be in the pensioner class where the only economic perspective that they ever need to care about is their pension provision, and nothing to do with anything that's regards to workers' rights. And that's a huge division in our country at the moment. So that's why I get frustrated when people try and claim that there is some kind of unified reactionary working class in this country, because it's just as classist as the middle class people who are liberal types who do the same thing. But then we need to attack Lee Anderson rather than defend him. Because we're really having the wrong conversation. Because it's not about working class people at all, it's about older people. He's there because this kind of bootstraps mentality is clearly something that is dwindling fast as far as the vast majority of the working age electorate is going. People don't believe in this graft anymore. They've seen their wages collapse. They've seen their conditions collapse. They've seen inequality be rampant. They've seen public services shut down. They don't really care about the benefit scrounger narrative anymore. That's dwindling. That's far less popular amongst working age people. But it's enough ingrained in the swing voters there that Lee Anderson is a perfect candidate to do this for. And it's why the Labour Party are clear on their positions to be to the right of the Conservative Party on things like immigration, for example. To be the party of being tough on crime, quote unquote. Because they're trying to appeal to the same people as Lee Anderson is, just being slightly less brazen about it. But will it work as an electoral strategy? I don't know. I don't know whether it's going to work in the long run. But we have to think about these demographic shifts to do with the decline of manufacturing. They're super important in how we understand our society. Because that's where the wealth gap is. Young people are poorer than they've ever been. And people in their 50s and 60s, and these are Thatcher's children that Lee Anderson belongs to. And that's why he was very welcome, even after being a victim of the Thatcher administration whilst he was a coal miner. It's why now he's in his older age, he's happy to throw his previous compatriots under the bus, because his material interests and the cultural interests and the material interests of the people that he's culturally associated with, they've also changed as well. And that is why Lee Anderson is in the position that he's in. He is not the quote-unquote man of the people. Like Penny Mordaunt was in the comments, saying people will look at Lee Anderson and say, he's the man that speaks for me. But these aren't a silent majority. This is a very specific, very, very specific electoral demographic. And that's what's being pitched to here. And the frustrating thing is that the media still treat them like some kind of unified voice of the working class in this country, when they really aren't at all. In any sense of the words. When was the last time that you saw a TV Vox Pop interview with a young person? It's always the same people from the same age demographics that they interview in these places, because these are the people that most of all don't engage with the news, but also the people who get represented by the news. And they're obsessed with it. They're obsessed with this particular group of people. Actually, and it's they usually will get referred to as other people by calling them the white working class, by trying to say that because left-leaning parties are too engaged in identity politics, they're somehow pushing these people away, without properly understanding
I'm literally
that a lot of these
a communist.
Thank you for the follow, Donnie Marco. Thank you. A lot of these people have completely different material interests to everybody else. They're on their way out of the labour force as they start to retire, so their material interests completely change. And this is where the future of our elections for the foreseeable future is going to lie, is where the future of our political discourse is going to lie. Unless young people actually get out there and start properly expressing their views and having themselves heard and being part of the discourse and are allowed to take part in the discourse on a popular level, this is still going to be the hegemonic narrative that we look at with regards to working class politics in this country, and it's incredibly toxic, right? We at the moment, in the wake of the the quote-unquote protests happening in Knowsley over the weekend, we are being told that even though this was essentially these people were being bussed up into Knowsley by a neo-Nazi group called Patriotic Alternative, we are being told that we are somehow the metropolitan liberal establishment, despite being working class ourselves, for saying that these people who were there setting fire to shit were racist by saying, well, that you just hate the working class. The reason you hate them is because they're working class, not because they're racist. I'm like, well, these people, this idea that somehow that the working class are going to be more racist than everybody else, it's nonsensical. Like, the people who read the Daily Mail, these are like landlords and shit. Like, they may be older people, but they're far more like to have asset wealth than the actual working people in this country. It's a false divide and a false dichotomy that I'm really sick of the establishment media in this country pushing. And do you know why the establishment media in this country push it? Because they don't understand, because they don't live in our communities, they don't hang around with anybody from the working class. So the working class too, the privately educated elites in our journalism media sphere, the working class is always going to be a caricature to them. Because the diversity of ideology and opinion amongst our communities is never going to be known to them. It's only going to be out of the caricatures of what they think is working class from whatever received wisdom that they get from their media circles and the actual communities they hang out in, which are completely different to ours. Like, the big club is never going to know the working class communities in this country. As Akala was saying in the clip that we just watched, racism as a political policy was put from the top down, from elite academics, not from the bottom up. Like, working class people are not going to be the people that are mainly going to be racist in this country. It's coming down from a very kind of establishment level and gets propagated by the media and by institutions like that, by the culture wars that get stoked by a Conservative Party that wants this shit to happen and wants the conversation to be around these things, rather than, for example, the economic emancipation of the working class. And when we see this, we're seeing this with the change in representation somewhat right now. One of the biggest working class advocates on TV in this country, and there's fucking Mick Lynch, who is outwardly an anti-racist. Eddie Dempsey the same. They're outwardly, deliberately anti-racist, and they are there specifically to try and represent a broad coalition of people from different backgrounds who are all fundamentally, on an economic perspective, working class. If you want a real man of the people, quote unquote, a real man who speaks for this demographic, it's fucking Mick Lynch. It's not Lee Anderson.